I'd like to tell you a bit about the Oxcam Arc plans as they currently stand, and I want to concentrate on the housing threat, which is very serious still, and on the idea of saving nature, which has been associated with the Arc plans, or making the Arc green. I want to show you that the idea of net gain is actually a dangerous delusion. We will lose nature, we can't save it. Mostly in the past, we've developed simply by concreting over nature. We've built roads, which are not just to speed up the journey from A to B, but actually they're to open up the countryside for housing development, as you can see in this slide here. The difference of the Oxcam Arc is that in the process of this sort of development, they're proposing to save nature. Now, how are they going to do it? Let's look first of all at the area that we're talking about. The Oxcam Arc is now defined as the 5 ceremonial counties you can see here, Oxfordshire to Cambridgeshire. And at the bottom of the screen, you can see the total number of houses, people, and the total area of the 5 ceremonial counties. Now, Oxcam Arc plans intend to add 1 million houses to that total, so that's a 66% increase, and more than 1 million people, that's a 51% increase. This is a huge increase in the houses and population in a relatively small area, about 8% of England, about 5% of the UK. It's a huge development project. The particular dimensions of that development project were defined in 2018 in this Partnering for Prosperity document that comes from the National Infrastructure Commission, the NIC. And the headlines are shown there, they're fairly straightforward. The bottom line, 163 billion increase, is really what it's all about. We're doing all of points 1 to 4 there in order to achieve the 163 billion increase. And Michelle, right at the start of this talk, said, well, since we've cancelled the expressway, which is point 2 there, does that mean that the whole project is shelved? By no means it doesn't. In fact, the whole thing is going on full steam ahead, and they're finding alternative ways to connect Oxford with Milton Keynes, which was the job of the expressway. So effectively, we've got almost an expressway by another name. First of all, I want to look at the proposed distribution of those million houses to see how it might impact Oxfordshire and the other counties. This is a slightly earlier map of the Oxcam area, and I'm outlining the ceremonial county of Oxfordshire here, and the other counties, they're not quite the ceremonial counties. I've called them Northants, Bucks and Beds and Cambridgeshire. And the million houses were distributed by Savills in these pie charts, and the total of all the houses in all the pie charts adds up to the 1 million. That is the target. So if you look at just Oxfordshire, that pie chart has 3 different coloured sections. The pink section is for currently planned homes. Savills reckoned it was 60k in Oxfordshire. In fact, of course, it's 100k in the Oxfordshire growth deal. The dark blue segments are for London commuter homes. And finally, the brick red ones are for the additional houses that the Oxcam plans or the Oxcam Arc would unlock, very often by drilling roads through green countryside and building houses along them. And the blue segments amount to about 23% of those million homes. So our 5 counties will become the dormitory counties for a quarter of all those new houses. In the yellow splashes here, we've got the increase in houses proposed under these plans compared with the current housing stock. So in Oxfordshire's case, we're going to more than double our existing housing stock. It's an increase of 105%. In Cambridgeshire, it's 81%. And on the bottom right here, you've got the Office of National Statistics prediction of the increase in household numbers in the UK to the same date, 2050. So you need to compare what the average UK figure will be, 16%, with the much greater figures proposed for the ARC, between 4 and more than 6 times the projected national increase, the average increase. And looked at on the UK scale, of course, the map here is the entire UK, including Northern Ireland, and the ARC counties are in the pale blue at the bottom here. Now, the Office of National Statistics predicts that by 2050, there will be 16% more households, and that will require about 3 million more houses across the entire length and breadth of the white areas here. But 1 million of those, 1 million of the 3 million, will go into the ARC. Why should a third of all new houses go into less than 1/20th of the UK's land area? It's a massive overdevelopment project, and it's uncertain that the natural environment can cope with this level of overdevelopment. Now, associated with the Oxcam Arc scheme is the promise to double nature, to make the arc the green arc. And the Arc Universities group, the 9 universities across the Arc, are joining together in the schemes to double nature to ensure net gain, to make this a green arc so that nature is saved as we build 1 million houses. This is not going to happen, and I'd like to explain why. But you've got a couple of documents here. One is from the RSPB, Nature's Arc, be a part of it. We were invited about a year or so ago. And more or less at the same time, the Wildlife Trusts launched something called the 100 Miles Wilder scheme, which include 3 steps to building greenery into the proposed Arc plans. And then Natural Cambridgeshire came up with the idea of doubling nature. And you can see the quote there from the Natural Cambridgeshire scheme. As Sue pointed out, of course, if you haven't got much nature to start with, it's quite easy to double a rather small amount. And Cambridgeshire has got the least coverage of natural woodland of any county in England. So it'd be quite easy to double Cambridge's woodland cover. But the idea of doubling nature from Natural Cambridgeshire was eventually adopted by the Arc Universities group, which are in charge of all the ecological developments associated with the Arc plans. And this is one of a couple of documents that group has produced. There's a quote there from Councillor Bridget Smith, who's essentially the Arc Czar or Arc Czarina for these greening Arc plans. And if you ask Councillor Smith, what do you mean by doubling nature? She's pretty honest about it. She says, well, I haven't got a clue what doubling nature means, and I don't have a clue how to do it. But I've got some very clever people help me to do it. That, quite frankly, is a slightly alarming statement because, as Sue pointed out, the environment is actually our life support system. Why should we be worried? Well, as Sue indicated, the Environmental Bill, which has just come back to Parliament from the House of Lords, it includes the requirement for all new developments to ensure 10% net environmental gain. And we're going to look at the dubious claims for net environmental gain and how, in fact, it means a net loss of wildlife areas, despite what everybody is saying about it, including, alarmingly, the wildlife trusts. So let's have a look at how DEFRA explains net environmental gain. We've got 3 scenarios here. Let's look at scenario A, first of all, the simplest of all. We start off with a field with trees in it. A developer comes along and builds houses. Now, if there's sufficient space left on the building site to put 2 trees, then effectively we've got net environmental gain on site. This is called on-site offsetting. What I forgot to say is that the developers are obliged to go through a 4-step process, of which offsetting is the last step. So first of all, they must avoid harm. Second, they've got to mitigate it. Thirdly, enhance the site. And if all of that fails, then they have to do off-site offsetting. So scenario A is the easiest one. Scenario B, we start off with a field, in this case with 4 trees. We build houses on it, but you can only allow 2 trees to grow. So the developer has to pay for compensatory habitat creation somewhere else, off-site offsetting. And that's the thing on the right here with some trees and some rivers and some reeds in it. This, I think, is a much more common scenario than scenario A. And the final scenario is when, for example, as in scenario B, but the developer cannot find sufficient close by sites for offsetting, so he or she pays a tariff, and that tariff is used for offsetting somewhere else in the country, or maybe even somewhere abroad. Now, of course, the dangerous scenario C is that all the local people see all the pain of development, this here, and they see none of the gain of offsetting because it's occurred tens or hundreds of miles away. But that is the principle embedded in the Environmental Bill. There must be net environmental gain. And for the Oxcam Arc development, if there is no development at all, there will be no funds for nature. There are definitely no strings attached funds, the sort of funds that John Lawton asked for in making space for nature. The developer's quite clear about this. If you don't let us develop, we're not going to fund nature recovery or doubling nature. Now, you can liken biodiversity offsetting effectively to taking Westminster Abbey, a wonderful, beautiful structure like our natural ecosystems, turning that into a pile of stones and putting that on an offset site somewhere else and saying it's the same thing. Of course, it's not the same thing. It won't be the same thing for several hundred years in the case of ancient woodland, by which time, of course, all the species dependent on that woodland have completely disappeared. And by the way, HS2 have done exactly this. When they've knocked down ancient woodland along the track of HS2, they've taken sapling trees from that woodland, they planted them on the offset site, and they said, we are moving ancient woodlands. I mean, that's an insult to the intelligence of a 10-year-old, quite frankly. I want to explain why, in fact, net gain actually is actual loss, because net gain is all about yields and actual loss is all about stocks. And this is explained very clearly in the Dasgupta review and the work from the Bennett Institute, which in fact parallels Dasgupta's recent review. So let's think about yields and stocks. And the simplest example is to think of a fishery, because a fishery, there's a stock of fish in the sea. That stock every year grows by some fish lay eggs and some of the fish die. Now we come along with our trawlers and we take a yield from that stock. And each year we take a yield, but if we overexploit the stock, we work it too hard. You can see that stock at the bottom is beginning to diminish. And as the years go by, the stock gets lower and lower because we're working the stock too hard. We're trying to take more and more effectively out of less and less. And the final situation here is basically the stock collapses and we have no yield to take. I try to apply that idea of yield and stock to the 10% gain in terrestrial ecosystems, and we do that here. We've got a stock, we've got two fields, one field, one on the left, field two on the right. They're identical before development gets going, and we've got in each field a certain number of biodiversity units, 100 units. This is according to DEFRA's biodiversity metric, which we can talk about later on if you like. Two identical fields. What happens is the developer comes along and buys up field one and decides to build on it. Now, the first thing that happens, of course, the environment gets dug up, the concrete gets laid, the houses are built. So clearly, if houses cover this entire field one, off-site offsetting is required. So the various conservation charities, NGOs and so on come along, they offer their services to the developer, and as a result of their services, they generate or create 110 units on the offset site. So originally the offset site had 100 units, but they've got net gain on that offset site through their conservation activities. And in total now we've got 210 biodiversity units on a site that originally had 100. We have achieved what the Environment Bill requires. We've got 110% yield, so we've got 10% net gain. The Environmental Bill is satisfied, but look to see what in fact we've happened, because we've halved the stock. We're getting half the stock to do more than twice the work of the existing stock. And the field on the left is no longer available for nature. And that's the Achilles heel of all these attempts at net gain. We are going to work less and less stock, harder and harder to achieve our biodiversity gain, our capital flows, and our life support systems. So offsetting is a certain destruction of habitats in one place with the uncertain hope of reconstructing them elsewhere, and it always involves the certain loss of stock. Now, the UK hasn't got much experience of offsetting, but globally there's quite a lot of experience. Let's see what the result is. In Europe, they've been practicing it for more than 40 years, and as you can see, a substantial proportion have failed to deliver net gain. In Australia, they've been doing also for quite a long time. Some studies have shown that on the offset site, it would take more than 140 years to achieve net gain on the offset sites. And this is the limited UK experience. We've had some retrospective pilot studies, and you can see that there was a shortage of expertise or suitable offset sites, or importantly, an unwillingness of developers to pay for the full impacts of their development. These are all problems ahead. Very recently, the Dyce Institute in the University of Kent have carried out a survey of all examples of offsetting they could find in the literature. They found almost 16,000 articles, but in fact, very few studies from which they could see whether or not gain was achieved in those studies. And in fact, it wasn't gain at all. It was no net loss, so neither loss nor gain. The studies covered 300,000 hectares of offset sites, about 2% of the global offset area. So it's actually quite a respectable sample size. What were the results? And look at the histograms here. In only about a third of the examples was no net loss achieved. Not net gain, just no net loss. And in 2/3 of the site in brown, and the various colours of form there, either it wasn't achieved or they couldn't be certain of the outcome. This is a shocking success record for something which the Oxcam ARC plans have basically bet their farm on. And Dieter Helm, who's the chair of the Natural Capital Committee, says no one has yet achieved net environmental gain at scale. And of course, the 5 Oxcam ARC counters are definitely an attempt to achieve gain at rather a large scale. So remembering that the net gain chance of success from the DICE Institute studies was about 33%, let me ask you a question. If you had a loved one who was going in for a major operation where the chance of survival was about 1 in 3, would you be happy with that? Because that's exactly what the Oxcam ARC plans are involved in now. A 1 in 3 chance of success, and as we saw, it really isn't success, it involves a loss of stock. Why should we be worried? Well, here's an advert that came out very recently from BBOUT. And it's an advert for a managing director of a Future Nature WTC, which is a wildlife trust consultancy. It's actually a new venture for BBOUT. It's a business arm. And that business arm is offering the BBOUT expertise with knowledge of legislation, species habitats, etc., and knowledge of the planning system. BBOUT and the other wildlife charities are getting lined up to offer their services for offsetting, not just, of course, across the ARC, but for all development across the country, which will be the requirement of the Environment Bill. And if you look at the application pack for this job, should you be interested in the BBOUT job, we've got this requirement here. Well, you've got to know something about biodiversity net gain. And you've got to have knowledge of the development planning regime, a new planning white paper, the Environment Bill and so on, and the application of biodiversity net gain principles and DEFRA's biodiversity metric. This is the Wildlife Trusts not exactly selling their soul to the devil, but I think walking completely unawares into the trap of greenwashing. In fact, this is probably a view of what the Wildlife Trusts are getting themselves in for. At the top here, you've got all the people pulling the strings. You've got governments and ministries and departments on the left there, and you've got all the development agencies, including Oxford and Cambridge colleges, and these are just a few of very, very many, pulling the strings. And the question is, can the wildlife trusts really resist the power of the lobbying of these groups pulling their strings? Thank you very much. We started off life as the No Expressway Group and managed to achieve the Expressway being cancelled. We've now got to change our name. So our new name is Stop the Arc, and we'd be very grateful if you join us in the future. We haven't actually got a new Gmail address yet, or indeed a new URL yet. We're working on that. So if you want to contact us, please use the old contact details which are here. Thank you very much.